A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
Well, let's talk changing demographics and the escalating influence of artificial intelligence in light of our ageing population, fall in fertility rates. Our next guest is asking, where have all the babies gone? When we consider how societies function with such monumental change, we can't help but ask what sort of impacts there will be given the arrival of artificial intelligence. Alister Cameron is serving with Power to Change. You'll know Power to Change, formerly known as Campus Crusade for Christ. He's back with us. Alister, a special welcome back to 2020.
Oh, thank you, Neil. Great to be here.
Alister, let me start with the question, where have all the babies gone? Let's start with that before we start getting into AI and such things. But this is a major thing and it's all around us. We all know that there are less babies today. What are your thoughts?
Yes, Neil, and if we, in this conversation, don't get too far into AI, because that fertility question is such a big one, we'll leave it at that. But look, just as a caveat, we'll be talking about fertility this morning, and I'm mindful that there are folks that desperately want to have children and can't, and I'm certainly not wanting to be insensitive to that. And when we talk about fertility in the population context, it's a word used to mean who's having babies and how many are we having, as opposed to the ability to have them. So just that caveat there for consideration of certain people. But the question is that everybody asks in every generation, at what point in life should we settle down and get married? And at what point in life should we have children? And it turns out that generations are changing the way they answer that. And perhaps a helpful way to look at that is that once upon a time, generations past were looking, and perhaps yours and mine, Neil, were looking at marriage and having children as what you might call a cornerstone event. It's the thing that you build around, that the structure builds on top of that cornerstone. It's an early building block of the good life, if you like. What's happening now, according to one sociologist called Andrew Cherlin, is that the younger generations are looking more and more at marriage and having children as a capstone achievement. In other words, it's not the cornerstone, it's the capstone. It doesn't come at the front, it comes at the back. So you first of all have to get a number of other things in place, a number of other building blocks, home, mortgage, lifestyle, car, get some travel out of your system. And crucially, you need confidence. You need to feel like you've landed in a place where you can then do these other things. And that is a dramatic shift. That has never happened before. And we can look into that. But the fruit of that at a macro level is that population is peaking. We're actually just not having the numbers of children we used to have. And this is almost entirely across the world.
Alister, marriage and children, well, in time immemorial, it used to be what you do to drive down all the risks. In other words, you had to have children who would look after you in your old age and who would run the farm. So the agrarian society that we might think of ancient times, and even in modern times, people who work the land, they know that their children have been the assurance that the family property would continue after their years, like an insurance policy of some sort.
Yes, you're absolutely right. The language of risk and insurance is a good way of looking at it. Historically, if you were well into your 20s and you weren't having children, there was a big question mark over you. Trend data now is saying that among Gen Zs, so we're talking about roughly 15 to 30. Demographers vary on their definitions, but let's just work with that. So everybody in their 20s, 50% of all Gen Z females will not have a child before they reach the age of 30. So for various reasons, there's a postponement of having children, typically, on average, until the age of 30. And then perhaps up to 50% of those who reach 30 childless will never go on to have a child. Again, just on the statistics, either for voluntary or for involuntary reasons. And so what it shows us is that Gen Z females are twice as likely as the previous generation to either never have them, report that they'll never have them, or to have them very, very late. And as you might consider, Neil, if you don't begin as a husband and wife, or as partners, as the case may be, even really seriously thinking about children until 30, it's all the less likely that you're going to have a large family. And so we're seeing a drop in what's called the population replacement rate to all-time lows.
Okay, all-time lows, and that's got all sorts of ramifications, the effects that go from the lower child replacement rate, that thought of, 2.1 children, and some people say, how do you have 0.1 of a child? But there's 2.1 children, and really to address that, to keep an economy growing, which is really the way our governments tend to think, they've got to focus on some different ways to be able to address that, and immigration is the one that we're seeing, is the way that they see that as a solution. Any thoughts from you?
Well, look, on the immigration question, that's absolutely true. It's not the only solution. What the analysts, and again, I'm not the expert on this topic, but it's one that absolutely fascinates me because it is really one of maybe 7 global mega trends that the experts and the demographers and the scientists are investigating. But efforts thus far to redress population rate or population replacement rate or fertility rate decline have largely not worked. One of them definitely is immigration. Now, as you and I well know, the problem with immigration is that you are importing people from somewhere else. And when they come from somewhere else, they come with culture, they come with language, they come with various different baggage, if you will. And while I'm a very strong believer in migration in principle, obviously the devil's in the detail, and you can create all kinds of cultural disruption, as the UK, for example, and much of Europe is experiencing right now. And so Australia must absolutely continue a focus on immigration, but it can't be the only way that we address this. And just for context for your listeners, Neil, the high point for Australia was 1961, which was the middle of the baby boom, when the average Australian woman was having 3.55 children. Again, it's hilarious to think of 0.55 of a child, but 3.55 children. Today, we're down to 1.63 births per woman. That's less than half, and granted that the baby boom was a high point. And if the population replacement rate is 2.1, what that means is the current Indigenous Australian population, by which I mean everybody who's living here, we are progressively dwindling now. And in fact, globally, what's going to happen is the population is going to hit a peak of somewhere over 9 billion, maybe 9.1, 9.2 billion, maybe around sort of 2060, and then the entire world starts shifting downwards. You have to look to Africa and a few other places to find any country on the planet, actually, even India, where the population replacement rate is healthy. So even immigration ultimately is not going to solve the problem. Either the world works out how to encourage family and encourage the values that support that, the economics that supports that, and a range of other factors, or the whole world population is, in a longer-term picture, in decline.
Yes, a longer-term picture, and you just got to look at any demographers, the sorts of things demographers are saying about nations like China and India, and the potential for their significant declines as early as the end of this decade. So it's not just something that's way, way off into the future. This is actually happening right now. Hey, what sort of factors do you think have been contributing here to this? Well, we could talk globally and we can talk here in Australia, but a declining fertility. What are the factors that you think are contributing?
Yeah, and they're many, and they're varied, and they're contentious, Neil. So I'll just throw a few out there and grab any if they particularly grab your attention. But firstly, I would say reproductive technologies. So obviously, once upon a time, part of fertility, part of just being a husband and wife in marriage, was the realization that nature happens. Whereas now we can really avoid that. So both the pill and abortion very, very obviously mean that people have much greater control of their reproductivity, and as a consequence, there are just fewer babies being born, because once upon a time, it wasn't all entirely about one's own choice. It was also about the reality that that's just what happens. Then there's this issue of and again, I don't want to play this one out too far, but I think it's worth considering the social acceptability today of homosexuality and transsexuality, when in that particular cohort of the population, they have much lower fertility rates on general. They're just not having children like the general population.
So it's interesting, isn't it, that even our attitudes to sexuality are affecting our fertility rates. So it's not just that it's one little group off on the side. It actually affects everyone's thoughts about reproducing children.
It does, yeah. And then there's also some very strong economic factors as well. Things like female labour force participation, which we all applaud. But there is a statistic, a straightforward correlation that says the more educated a woman is, then the later and the less children she will have. So what has been a blessing to our society, which is that we've taken women out of an uneducated situation to a place of empowerment, a place of choice, and so forth, all of which, in properly understood is a great thing, but it has just logically led to fewer children. And then there's also the really clear economic consequence of a shifting demographic, where in Australia we will have more baby boomers retiring, or that generation of retirees who are moving out of economic productivity into a form of economic dependency, hopefully on their own resources, but not always, with fewer people able to come into the job market to supply a strong labour force. Well, there is a consequence to that. The economics of being a young person trying to save for a house and so forth becomes more challenging because we're not in as strong an economic position.
Hey, well, let's talk about one particular factor here, and let's talk about whether the traditional marriage that we might think of as Christian believers, marriage between a man and a woman who love one another and love their children, and therefore go on to make a life together, for a lifelong engagement at raising those children, the desirability of traditional marriage, and we might be able to point fingers on all sorts of things when it comes around to this, but this is one of those factors, isn't it, that's affecting the birth rate?
It is, and it's really interesting. There's an author called Louise Perry, which some of your listeners may have come across. I'm scanning my bookshelf as we speak to find it. I may not be able to, but she has written a secular book essentially parroting or landing in a very strong, sensibly Christian conviction that the sexual revolution has been particularly destructive for women because the desirability of a male mate and the conditions under which a woman is almost instinctively most comfortable to look at settling down and having children, and there are similar for men. The traditional image of marriage is really that, with a cherry on top. But you look at the more loose, the weaker ties that are part of, or that are features of de facto relationships, various forms of cohabitation and so forth, do not lend themselves to the confidence that couples need to have to settle down. And so the elevation of the traditional Christian image of marriage for our generation, I think this is one of the wonderful things about the Christian worldview and the Christian gospel message. It's that in Christ, we uphold a vision of what male and female is and what the marriage relationship is and what that context for bringing children into the world is all about, which is becoming more and more revolutionary. And I think we need to celebrate that, and we need to be experts at it.
Celebrating and becoming better at what that traditional form of marriage actually contributes to a society. Hey, let's talk about, and this may be where one of those intersections with AI goes, because lots of jobs are at risk here, and there's change, and maybe the number of jobs that might be lost might be taken up in other dimensions, but increased job insecurity. People thinking, well, the security of my future doesn't look particularly good. I might not have children. Any thoughts around that sort of insecurity that might be in the minds of younger Australians?
Yeah, absolutely, and it's actually at epidemic levels. So in the last year or two, some research was done by one organisation asking senior company executives and new entrants into the workforce, which would reflect age, of course, as well as seniority, how confident are you that your job is going to be around in a decade? And only 12% of senior executives were concerned, whereas 63%, I think was the number, of Gen Z job entrants, people in their 20s, sort of trying to make their way in their careers, only 63% had any confidence that their job would even exist in roughly 10 years' time. And this was very much to do with the impact of artificial intelligence and that sense that automation, robotics, computerization, and just, some of it might be more folkloric, more sort of speculative than real, but there is a sense out there that AI is and it is a transformative technology. And as such, for that younger generation who are already confronted with all the things that we've talked about, to add that piece on top of, will the kind of job that I'm even looking at exist, is quite challenging. And Neil, anecdotally, I've just spent the last few days working on some software development for some stuff that I need to do. I have a history in software development. But what I did this time is I engaged an artificial intelligence agent, plugged it into my computer, told it where the software on my computer was that I wanted to work on, and essentially instructed it, and it just went off and built it for me under my supervision. It's not that long before even my supervision isn't going to be that valuable. So I'm looking at people in my family who, like myself, have gone down a path of computer software-related work, realizing that that is one of the very first cabs off the rank for complete disruption, if not destruction. And I can fully understand if a young man's come out, or a woman with a computer science degree, to use that particular example, it would be really quite scary right now to try and read the tea leaves and figure out where is this all going and what does it mean for my economic security.
And it might be one of those things, adapt as early as you can to this new age of artificial intelligence so that you can have a level of confidence for what that might mean for your future marriage, for your future children. Interesting, isn't it, that when we do family, rare for people to choose childlessness. Maybe they're choosing lesser numbers of them, but it's very unusual. But this new day that we're in, causing people to, even have a mental health crisis around the thought of having children.
Yes, that's right. And depending on what part of the world you look at and how you analyse it, but that younger Gen Z generation, which I feel bad speaking about, and I don't want to be too quick to speak on behalf of them, but the observations are that mental health has become, a very big talking point among that younger generation. But to their credit, they are speaking. They don't have the hesitations that previous generations have had to talk the language of mental health. But then from a Christian perspective, I think we really need to understand that there is a particular flavour of anxiety out there in the water, and it is a tremendous opportunity for the gospel message to be proclaimed, that we have a different definition of success. We have a different definition of the good life. We have a very, very particular angle on what it is to do life and relationships well.
So as things are changing, what I can hear you say here is that church is going to look a whole lot different. But it might not look a whole lot different if people in church don't actually take the bull by the horns here, adapt to the new environment around AI, understand this, as you say, a redefinition of what success means and what that means for marriage and family. And it's going to look rather different to the world. And my suspicion is, and perhaps we'll have to end on this, my suspicion is that there might be a lot of people who are outside of church a little bit jealous of the things that are happening within church and in the families and in the relationships that happen within this whole ecosystem of knowing God and understanding the powerful message of the gospel. What are your thoughts about the future and what the church ought to look like?
On some levels, Neil, AI is no different from anything else that's come along that risks challenging us, threatening us, derailing us, causing us anxiety, like everybody else. The difference is, though, we need to take these things as they come, technology innovations, changes in society, and have a really confident filter of biblical truth that we live out in community called the church, with our own distinct traditions and customs and values and rules and rituals and language. These are the things that strengthen us. These are the things that come out of an inquiry in Scripture, but they don't just remain conversations about personal morality. They are translated into the way we live our lives. And in that sense, we are urging and encouraging each other to experience that hope, that supernatural hope that comes from knowing Jesus, living our lives in the power of the Holy Spirit, and fighting, and I don't know if that's the right word, but working hard on this thing called Christian community, this distinct community in the world. The Apostle Peter talks about us being aliens or sojourners in a strange land. And there is this sense of distinctiveness. We need to be proud of it. We need to lean into it. We need to explore it and experiment. And we need to get really good at saying no to things or being very cautious and thoughtful and measured about the things that we see happening in the world and how we will allow or whether we will allow those things into our lives and how we will pass them through that grid of biblical truth and what it means as Christians to live these things out. Because not everything's possible, as Paul would say, but not everything is beneficial.
Really good words of wisdom coming from you, Alister Cameron. And, boiling all that down, get good at being a Christian, because our nation needs you to be good at being a Christian right now. And there's lots of dimensions, lots of things you've got to learn in that whole process. That would come down to what it is to be a disciple of Christ and learning how to live your life aligned with Him, and how that relates to where the rubber hits the road on those day-to-day things that you do in your life, including having your marriage and family and a long-term future. Alister Cameron, great getting your insights. I'll point listeners to powertochange.org.au, powertochange.org.au, to connect with Alister Cameron. Alister serves with Power to Change, formerly known as Campus Crusade for Christ. And if you're wondering, I often refer to this, the biggest mission organisation in the world, much bigger now than it ever was when they started calling it that, because of the amazing work they do on university and school campuses around the world. But Campus Crusade for Christ, certainly well known these days in Australia, known as Power to Change. Alister, thanks so much for your insights today on 2020.
My pleasure, Neil. Thanks so much, mate.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.